Okay, good evening. Welcome everyone to the Library of Congress. I am Catalina Gomez. I am a librarian and a curator in the library's Latin American, Caribbean, and European division. And it's a great thrill for us to be presenting together with the Library of Congress Literary Initiatives Office this event, Nobel laureate poets Gabriela Mistral, Nelly Sachs, and Wisława Szymborska. Before I introduce our event, let me ask you to please silence your cell phones or any device that might interfere with our presentation. Today's program is being hosted as part of the library's Women's History Month celebrations, as well as part of a popular series at the library called Live at the Library, which we produce every Thursday night. We hope that you all join us on future Thursday nights as well. We leave our exhibits open and encourage you to wander through the library and enjoy everything that this magnificent building has to offer. We also hope that you get a chance to check out our adjacent display that curators here in the Latin American, Caribbean, and European division put together. The showcase includes materials from our collections not only related to the three poets being highlighted today, but also to other women from the regions covered by our division who have been recipients of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Tonight's program is being presented in collaboration with the Embassy of Poland. And we also want to welcome and acknowledge the Chilean, Swedish, and German embassies and thank them for helping us promote this event. I want to formally welcome Mr. Bogdan Klich, Head of Mission of the Republic of Poland to the United States. And Isidora Rojas, Cultural Attaché at the Embassy of Chile. In addition, and this is such a treat, we want to acknowledge the presence of Michał Ruszynek, president of the Wisława Szymborska Foundation, a Polish scholar and writer who served as Szymborska's personal secretary from 1996 until her death in 2012. Mr. Ruszynek, So now moving on to our event. Our panel tonight includes an outstanding group of poets, scholars, and translators. We have professor and translator Deeny Morales, who will be talking to us about Gabriela Mistral, Joshua Weiner, also a professor and translator representing Nelly Sachs, and poet and president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, Edward Hirsch, to enlighten us about Wisława Szymborska. To moderate our panel, we have distinguished poet and scholar Rosanna Warren. Deeny Morales is a writer and translator who grew up between Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. A National Endowments for the Arts Fellow for her translation of Gabriela Mistral, Deeny Morales has translated poetry by Raúl Zurita, Nicanor Parra, and Amanda Berenguer, among other Latin American poets. Forthcoming works include Echo Poems, Storm, and Some Fringe Benefits, a volume of selected works by Nicanor Parra, which she has edited and translated for New Directions. Deeny also writes operas. Recent works include Las Místicas de México, which debuted in 2024 in the In series and the Children's Chorus of Washington. She teaches at the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. Joshua Weiner is the author of 3 books of poetry and a book of political cultural reportage, Berlin Notebooks, Where Are the Refugees? His translations include Nelly Sachs' Flight and Metamorphosis, which was shortlisted for Alta's 2023 National Translation Award, and Ernst Jandel's The Ordinary Rilke. His translation with Jay Hopler of Rainer Maria Rilke's Book of Pilgrimage was chosen by Arthur Z for Best Literary Translation in 2026. He currently teaches at the University of Maryland. Edward Hirsch is a celebrated poet and advocate for poetry. He has published 10 books of poetry, including The Living Fire, New and Selected Poems, and Stranger by Night. He has also published 8 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and 100 Poems to Break Your Heart. His newest book, the memoir My Childhood in Pieces, was published in 2025. His prizes include the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor. Since 2003, he has been the president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Rosanna Warren, our moderator today, taught in the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago from 2012 to 2023. Her book of criticism, Fables of the Self, Studies in Lyric Poetry, came out in 2008. Her most recent book of poems are Hindsight, So Forth, Ghost in a Red Hat, and Departure. She is the recipient of awards from the Academy of American Poets, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Guggenheim Foundation, among others. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much, Catalina, and our thanks to the library for gathering us around these three remarkable poets, Gabriela Mistral, Nelly Sachs, and Wisława Szymborska. My role here is simply to encourage my colleagues here to tell you about these extraordinary poets. We're going to go in chronological order by when the Nobel was awarded. Gabriela Mistral won it in 1945. Nelly Sachs won it in 1966, Wisława Szymborska in 1996. I'm going to invite each of our speakers to speak for 5 minutes introducing the poet, and then we'll talk a little bit and eventually come up and read some of the poems, and we'll see how the conversation and the readings emerge, like a jazz improvisation up here. But I wanted to put our gathering under the protection of 3 lines from Nelly Sachs, translated by Joshua Weiner. Because our 3 poets, Mistral, Sachs, and Szymborska, all wrote in times of cruelty and turmoil. Nelly Sachs, this century springs out of its molted calendar of death. So with that, let me invite Anna Deeny to tell us about Gabriela Mistral.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank Catalina Gomez and Allison Williams from the Latin American, Caribbean, and European Division, Robert Casper, Head of Poetry and Literature, and Rosanna Warren for your introduction. Also my colleagues and students at the Center for Latin American Studies, and Amy Stoll's former National Endowment for the Arts Director of Literature for the fellowship she gave me to support my translation of Gabriela Mistral, and I'd like to thank you for being here this evening. In 1945, Gabriela Mistral became the first Latin American writer and the 5th woman to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Née Lucila Godoy Alcayaga, Mistral was born in 1889 to a small family in the Elqui Valley of northern Chile, an isolated but breathtaking region at once bound and liberated by the circular and sublime Andes Mountains. Mistral's father would soon abandon the family, leaving her, along with an older sister and mother, exposed to precarious economic and social circumstances. Although Mistral was largely self-taught, she would become an intellectual and poet of international repute. Mistral began her career in primary and secondary education in Chile and wrote hundreds of essays on topics such as education, women, children, poverty, the environment, literature, culture, and politics. A Pan-Americanist who promoted regional solidarity and cooperation, Mistral joined Mexico's Minister of Education, José Vasconcelos, to develop a public rural school system after that country's revolution. She also worked for the United Nations in distinct official capacities, served Chile as a consul in various countries, and collaborated with the Institute for Intellectual Cooperation of the League of Nations between 1926 and 1934. Mistral's volumes of poetries include Desolación, Desolation, which she published in 1922, Ternura, which means tenderness, published in 1924 and 45, Tala, which means the felling of trees in 1938 and 1947, and lagar, which means wine press in 1954. Posthumous works include Poemas de Chile, Chilean poems, which was published in 1967 and 2010, and Lagar, too, which is wine press in 1991. Mistral also adopted a boy who some believed to be her nephew and some her biological son. His name was Juan Miguel Godoy, and she called him Yin Yin, and he took his own life in 1943 at the age of 18, only a few years before Mistral received the Nobel Prize. When she passed away in 1957, over 40,000 unedited manuscripts remained in her archive that was maintained by Doris Dana, Mistral's life partner, with whom she lived in New York. What I believe are the only recordings of her reciting her poetry are actually found here at the Library of Congress in the Archive of Hispanic Literature on Tape, which is an extraordinary archive. So this is a very special place to be for Mistral, and a lot of her papers were also received here at the Library of Congress. So one thing I wanted to say about Mistral that has really struck me is the fact that in Tala, which is the book that means the felling of trees, which she published in 1938, she had been living in Spain and the Spanish Civil War had begun in 1936. At the end of Tala, what she says in a section called Reasons for this book, she talks about the tens of thousands of children who were sent from Spain as refugees with the hope of being received in other countries. Several European countries and the UK received these children. The then Soviet Union received the children. In Latin America, they were mostly received by Mexico. The rest of Latin America, except for Venezuela, who received a couple hundred, did not receive the children, and the United States did not receive the children. This was difficult for Mistral because she said that it surprised her that her people had this attitude towards these children. And so what it tells us is that when a child or any person crosses a border, two categories come into conflict, the categories of citizen and the category of humanity. And it's an atrocity when the category of citizen wins out to the category of humanity. So that's the first thing she tells us about. The second thing is the fact that what defines us as a people is how we treat our children, whether they are biologically or non-biologically ours. So this was very unique about her work, was the importance of non-biological relationships between people, and that's a foundation. How we treat our children defines us in our humanity as a people. And the third point that's the important point as a poet is that what upset her about the fact that these children were not received in Latin America is the fact that they were not received in their language. And so language for Mistral is a homeland. It's a place that receives you in your orphanhood and your displacement. So that's really important points that I wanted to make for Mistral. Language is a place outside of country, beyond what she perceived as the dangerous category of nation that insisted upon the idea of citizenship before the idea of humanity. Mistral was also an early 20th century ecofeminist. There's a scholar called Erin Finser who talks extensively about this. This is important because in the early 20th century, women were largely foreclosed from participating in official political spaces of power when it came to discussions regarding the future of the environment and the buying and selling of lands, particularly in Latin America. She believed that the lands in Latin America had to be protected from being sold off to large external investors. And this was primarily because she believed in subsistence farming and the fact that subsistence farming was the most important way to protect the health of mothers and their children. So she believed, which is something we know, the health of children, the number one determining factor of the health of children is the health of their mothers. And she viewed this as, again, the cornerstone of humanity. And so that's why ecofeminism was very important for her. The other important point about Mistral is she believed she was a very theologically centered poet, and she drew from many different cosmogonies. So cosmogonies of original peoples across the Americas, Christian theology, Greek mythical theology and cosmogonies. And so, but she actually created these figures throughout her work that pierced through an idea of the body and gender as grounding who we are. She pierced through to the idea of the soul as a human. So, so that's what I wanted to say about Mistral. You don't want me to read a poem right now? No, later. I'll read a poem later. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Can you just come up and talk about Nelly Sachs for me? Nelly Sachs, the life story is not really very interesting, and then it gets incredibly interesting. It starts out being just a very normal life. She was born in 1891. Her dad's a manufacturer. He owns a rubber factory. Very typical kind of assimilated Jewish bourgeois childhood in a major European city that's gaining a lot of power as an industrial capital. She's very frail. She doesn't go to school much. She has private tutors. She reads, she writes, education, music, literature. These are all values that her family instills in her. She's a good dancer. She's not really encouraged to spend much time outside of the house as a teenager, but she develops friends. She starts writing. She's reading a lot of German Romanticism, symbolist poetry, Novalis, early modern German poetry, Rainer Maria Rilke. And she's writing as a teenager. She's writing basically, she's like a German romantic poet in the 19-teens, really. That's her affect. And she starts publishing when she's really an adult in the 1920s. So she's not a prodigy. And actually, poets tend not to be prodigies. They tend to take off much later than fiction writers, and I don't know why. That tends to cut across genders and nationalities, but she's appearing in newspapers, community periodicals. If you were in the literary culture in Berlin in the 1920s and someone asked you to point to the person who was least likely to win the Nobel Prize in 40 years, everybody would have pointed to Nelly Sachs. She's writing puppet plays, some short stories about animals. She's a really gentle, sensitive woman. Her dad dies in 1930, and it's 1930 in Berlin. She's living alone with her mother. Life becomes really isolated for her. Friends start to flee. She's interrogated by the Gestapo, loses her voice because of that. Nazi officers and their wives come to their apartment and requisition it and loot it. So the trauma's begun. People are being sent to the camps, her extended family. 1939, she and her mother receive deportation orders. She would have surely gone to the camps and would have surely perished. Amongst her reading as a child, she was a huge fan of Selma Lagerlöf, the Swedish novelist. And she had the gumption as a young woman to begin a correspondence with Lagerlöf, who we should shout out as the first woman Nobel laureate in 1909. And Lagerlöf became her lifeline, really, at this moment when she received this, this notice that they were going to be deported. Lagerlöf intercedes with the royal family in Sweden and somehow gets the country of Sweden to open its doors to Nelly Sachs. There's a kind of apocryphal story about a sympathetic police officer who gives them a tip not to take any trains because they would have been stopped. And she gets on one of the last flights out of Berlin with her mother and sets up in Stockholm. This is 1940. So now she's 50 years old. She's living in a tiny flat with her mother, maybe like 2 rooms. And as her mother sleeps through the night, Nelly Sachs writes poetry. And to make a little money, she starts translating Swedish poets, contemporary Swedish poets, most of whom were much younger than she is, and who have absorbed like what's happening in international modernism. Sachs had not really. She had really kind of gotten stuck with a kind of German romantic feeling in her poetry. But she starts to learn from these young Swedish poets as she's translating them, and her poetry starts to change. 1942, she learns that the labor camps were death camps and that her family has been destroyed. And she starts to write out of that trauma of loss. In 1947, she writes what's probably her most famous poem. It's called "Oh, the Chimneys." And it takes on a kind of collective Jewish identity of murdered victims. It's a kind of like, almost like a choral aria, these poems that she's writing. Her mother dies in 1950, and her poems take another really deep turn, and they start to become really compressed, really condensed. They start to become more fragmented, more modernist. She is looking out the window of her apartment across the courtyard into another apartment of Hasidic families who are celebrating at the end of each Sabbath. They're dancing, they're sharing food, and she has this thought like, oh, is this maybe what it means to be Jewish? She doesn't really know. She starts reading Jewish Kabbalah and the work of Martin Buber, all of his folkloric kind of anthropological work, gathering tales of the Hasidim, and her poetry starts to absorb these influences. And this amazing thing happens with these poems. They become more spiritual and more political. They become more personal. They become more concrete and more dreamlike. The syntax starts to break down. Reference float. Phrases are just kind of suspended without any attachment to immediate identifiable significance. They become more elemental. Poems are full of sand and wind and sun and the sea and dust. They become, in a sense, more mystical and more real. She's writing out of her own experience as a refugee now. And she's imagining the experience of refugees everywhere who are exposed to the elements on the run. This is late 1950s, and this is the book, Flight and Metamorphosis, that grabbed me and invited me, asked me to translate it anew. She wins the Nobel in 1966. She's the first woman in the German-speaking world to win it. Is she German? She's presented with honorary citizenship by the city of Berlin, her native city. She lives in exile for the rest of her life. She rarely travels. She's terrified that Nazis are out there, that they've just kind of melted into, the administration, into the bureaucracy of Germany, and are preparing themselves to come out. She develops terrific mental health problems, psychotic problems, delusions, persecution, paranoia, but she's not wrong. She is correct about what she fears. Her life, after winning the Nobel Prize, doesn't change at all. She lives a very starkly modest life until her death in 1970. She died just a few weeks after her good friend, Paul Celan, threw himself in the Seine. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
This is the edge here.
Got it.
Do you want the lamp?
I don't need it, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, got it. Hey everyone, so glad to be with you. Wisława Szymborska was born in 1923. She's part of a great tradition of Polish poetry. I'd start with Alexander Wad in the 1920s, and I highly recommend to you a book of his called My Century, which is a book of interviews that he did with Czesław Miłosz. Wad is a poet who came of age in the 20s. Czesław Miłosz is a poet who came of age in the 1930s. Wisława Szymborska belongs to a generation with Tadeusz Różewicz and Zbigniew Herbert, who came of age in the 1940s. This means that they lived through two totalitarianisms. First, the German, and then the Russian. Poland lost 6 million people during World War II. 3 million Poles, 3 million Jews. Then they were taken over by the Soviets, and Szymborska, like everyone, had to live under that tactless totalitarian brutality. And she came of age at a time when the Soviets were peddling socialist realism, one of the worst ideas ever imagined for what literature should do. What's important to understand is that Polish poetry felt the need to remake itself entirely from the beginning. You have a poetry that's starting from the ground up. And the first strike is Miłosz's dedication, where he says, try to understand these simple words as I'd be ashamed of another. There's no wizardry. To me, there's no wizardry in language, or no wizardry in words. This means that there's a kind of radical simplicity. Różewicz's poem, In the Midst of Life, begins after the end of the world. So Szymborska comes of age first with her first two books, but really she starts to be herself in her third book, Calling Out to Yeti. And then in some of her books, like No End of Fun, she starts to be herself. Like No End of Fun is a poem where the gods are looking down at human beings and they're saying, can you believe what they're doing down there? It's absolutely incredible. It's so comical. Or her book Could Have. She's a poet of the close shave. So could have is, it could have happened, it had to happen, it might have happened. You were saved because you're first. You were saved because you're the last. It all seems accidental. And this alerted me to the fact that all of her poetry is a poetry of the close shave. It's the narrow escape. It's only some kind of accident that we're alive. And because she's writing against the Soviet regime, or during a time of the Soviet regime, she has a kind of, I'd say, subversive intelligence. And what I mean by that is that she's writing against all collectivist thinking. That she herself says, I never speak from the point of view of the we, I only speak from the point of view of the I. So scolded are Polish intellectuals and writers and cultural figures by this collectivist we and its terrible bad taste. What's unusual about her is the way she takes an idea and examines it until it falls apart. Like she'll take the idea, say, it's a political age, everything is political. And she'll examine it, she'll run through it, she'll exhaust it until it becomes an absurdity to think that everything is political. All of her poems run through an idea where she begins with a premise and then follows it logically to see where it will lead. But behind this is the idea that we're limited by our subjectivity, that you can never be all places at once. And so this is part of our glory as people, but it's part of our limitation as people. That view with a grain of sand is such that you can only see what you can see as a person. You can't be all people at once. There's a wonderful poem of hers called Under One Small Star, where she starts apologizing for all kinds of things, some of which clearly she could not possibly have been responsible for. But one of the things she's apologized for is that she sometimes forgets that they're suffering. She sometimes forgets that there are people sleeping in the railroad station and that she's bringing home flowers. She sometimes forgets that the world is a slaughterhouse. And part of Szymborska's quality and character is that there's always an awareness of an historical abyss, but she's also very aware of the world's transient splendors. She speaks to its beauty. She has a wonderful poem called Miracle Fair. In A Miracle Fair, she speaks to the extraordinary things of what she calls commonplace miracles. And in her examination, in her joy, in her relentless intelligence, she recognizes that reality demands that we also mention this: life goes on. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. So just sitting here to converse a little bit, I was going to ask each of our poet, translators, missionaries here to speak about what is difficult about in translating the particular poet. So could we start with you, Anna? What's hard about translating Mistral? I think it's on.
Is it on? Is it on? Okay. Let's see. What's hard? First of all, I think that when you're translating, the poetry you're translating teaches you how to translate it. So that's how I begin in that conversation with that poet. There are many things that are difficult about Mistral. Mistral reminds me of Rubén Darío, who's extremely difficult to translate as well. It has not only been difficult to translate, it's been difficult to publish Mistral's translations. And that, in part, is because Mistral's line does not meet what an English language US reader, the appetite that reader has of an idea of what Latin American poetry is. So that idea is largely fulfilled by someone like Pablo Neruda. It's a poetry that is more ostensibly passionate, right? This idea of Latin American passion. It's a poetry that is ostensibly very political, and you can locate a language of communism in Neruda. But Mistral is much more radical than Neruda. Neruda would locate a cornerstone of society in a workers' movement, but also in this idea of brotherhood and adulthood. Like the community begins with a community of adults. For Mistral, her political foundation is much more radical than that. Her political foundation is maternity. But maternity for children who are not necessarily biologically yours. That's much more difficult to translate, and that's much more difficult to teach, which means it's more difficult to sell as an editor. The lines of Mistral are also slower. So her syntax is much more complex than Neruda. You lose subject and object. There are a lot of anachronisms, but then at the same time, there are words that you think are anachronisms, but they're actually neologisms. So they're new words that she has written into the language. So even in the Spanish, her language is a language that puts a wrench into the speed of a modern appetite of language. So she can be difficult to translate, first because it's difficult to sell her to an editor, and also because it's just, the line itself is difficult.
And because our time is, I see, getting a little brief, maybe you could read us one of her poems, and then we will go to the other two, because the clock is ticking horribly.
Would you like me to read it in my translation or in Spanish as well?
I'm worried about time,
okay,
so perhaps
I
just in your
will
translation.
I'm going to read a poem from Tala that has to do with what I was saying before. This is a poem that in Spanish is called País de Ausencia, and so country of absence. Country of absence, strange country, lighter than angel and subtle sign, color of lifeless algae, color of peregrine, with age of forever, ageless pleased. No pomegranate sprout or jasmine raised, nor does it have indigo skies or seas. Its name, I never heard it said, and in nameless country I will end. No bridge or boat brought me here. No one ever told me of country or isle. I did not search for it, nor could ever find. It looks like a fable that I learned, dream to be taken and dream to unleash. And it is my homeland I live and end to be. It was born in me of things that are not country, of so many homelands I had and lost, of the children who I saw die, of what was mine and left of me. I lost the cordilleras where I used to sleep, lost orchards of gold so sweet to be, lost the islands of cane and indigo and their shadows I saw them besiege, and together and lovers become country. Manes of clouds with no neck or spine, breaths asleep I followed behind, and in wandering years, country become. And in nameless country, I am undone.
Thank you. And Josh, we just have 5 minutes, so read a poem and say what's hard about it.
Sure. I've been asked to read a poem and say what's hard about it. So what's hard about translating Nelly Sachs is that she writes in German, and I'm a student of German, really. And she not only writes in German, but she writes Nelly Sachs's German. And so one of the experiences that I had with my friend Linda Parshall, who's here and who helped me with the translation, kept me honest in the language, and pressed hard in places where I really needed to be challenged, as well as helped, is that we didn't always know exactly what Nelly Sachs meant. And we would turn to friends of ours in Germany who loved Nelly Sachs's poetry, and we would ask them, what do you think this means? And they would say, oh, I don't know what it means. It's just really amazing and beautiful. So that, in a way, that difficulty was actually the portal in which I could move into to translator. That was like my opportunity, my chance, because aspects of the poetry were so indeterminate, you know. So I became fluent in Nelly Sachs as I gained some intermediate level of skill in German. And I couldn't have done it without Linda Parshall. So I'll read the one poem that Nelly Sachs read at the 1966 Nobel Laureate ceremony. This is the poem that she chose. She did not choose the poem that she is most famous for, "Oh, the Chimneys," which speaks in the voice of the collective murdered Jews, but rather in this voice, which is her own voice from Flight and Metamorphosis. In flight, what great welcome along the way, shrouded in the wind shawl, feet in the sand's prayer, which can never say Amen because it must move from fin to wing and further. Der kranke Schmetterling weiß bald wieder vom Meer, dieser Stein mit der Inschrift der Flieger hat sich mir in die Hand gegeben. The sick butterfly soon again knows the sea. This stone with the fly's inscription has dropped into my hand. In place of home, I hold the metamorphosis of the world.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Yes, in a second, but I'm so struck by what you're saying because with so many poets, Mistral and Sachs, in particular, you feel that the language is sometimes ahead of the thought. And that leads to certain particular problems in translation, but I don't think that's ever the case with Szymborska. I think in her case, the thought is ahead of the language, and I don't think the difficulty is you can't tell what she means. The difficulty is you have a philosophical poet writing in a deceptive and casual free verse. And so her lines have a kind of offhanded charm and quality and a colloquial quality that's very hard to capture complicated ideas in a simple language. Stanislaw Baranchek and Claire Cavanaugh did incredibly well at bringing Szymborska forward and creating the sort of colloquial tone. But Joanna Trzewiak also did very well in a book called Miracle Fair. I think it's because the quality of Szymborska's thinking comes through in all translations. There are better translations and worse translations, but the way the poetry works, the way it operates, the way it examines ideas and undercuts them and develops them, that comes through extremely well in English. So we're very fortunate that the clarity of this thinking comes through so beautifully into our language. So you don't have to guess what a great poet she is. You can read it yourself and see it in English. There was once a poll taken amongst readers in Poland about what was their favorite poem in modern Polish, and this poem by Szymborska won. So I'm going to read it. It's called The Joy of Writing. Why does this written doe bound through these written woods? For a drink of written water from a spring whose surface will Xerox her soft muzzle? Why does she lift her head? Does she hear something? Perched on four slim legs, borrowed from the truth, she pricks up her ears. Beneath my fingertips, silence, this word also rustles across the page and parts the boughs that have sprouted from the word woods. Lying in wait, set to pounce on the blank page, our letters up to no good. Clutches of clauses so subordinate they'll never let her get away. Each drop of ink contains a full supply of hunters equipped with squinting eyes behind their sights, prepared to swarm the sloping pen at any moment, surround the doe, and slowly aim their guns. They forget that what's here isn't life. Other laws, black on white, obtain. The twinkling of an eye will take as long as I say, and will, if I wish, divide into tiny eternities, full of bullets stopped in mid-flight. Not a thing will ever happen unless I say so. Without my blessing, not a leaf will fall, not a blade of grass will bend beneath this hoof's full stop. Is there then a world where I rule absolutely on fate? A time I bind with chains of signs? An existence become endless at my bidding? The joy of writing, the power of preserving, revenge of a mortal hand.
Thank you. And now we're going to invite questions from the audience. And do you have I guess there's a microphone there that, yes. So
Two
I put
microphones.
my glasses on so
One
I
on
can
each
see
side.
who's proposing to ask something. Does anybody want to say anything? I don't know what's happening. Oh, there. Well, you've all been stunned into silence.
No, I see a question back there.
Where?
Right there.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, what is your favorite poem from the poets that you shared? And if you could maybe speak on one sentence that really struck you.
For each of, yeah.
Yes, for each.
Thank you. What's your favorite poem?
I'm ready.
Good. What's your favorite poem? What's your favorite poem?
I love the poem by Wisława Szymborska called Cat in an Empty Apartment. And let me explain. This poem is really about the death of her lover, but you never come into it speaking of what she feels. What she presents is the point of view of a cat who's left in an empty apartment. And the poem states, you can't do that to a cat. You've just disappeared. Where are you? The cat doesn't know. And the poem runs through all the complications of what the cat feels and how the cat is really going to get even with you when you get back, because the cat is really mad. But the way that this poem operates through the sensibility of a cat creates a tremendous, restrained, underlying sense of grief that I find deeply moving.
It's a great question. I often think that one of the things that draws us to a poet at a certain moment is that they make a certain tone. It's not even necessarily in the sense of a poem or a line, but something happens in the voice. They convey a tone that has a feeling. You can't really parse it. You can't paraphrase it, but you're drawn to that. And so just thinking of the first poem I read by Nelly Sachs, from Flight and Metamorphosis, that really called to me, where I heard something and heard that she was speaking to our moment now. It's not the poem that I read. The last line of the poem in my translation goes, and she's writing about being a refugee, so being on the run. Rest, which is only a dead oasis word. Rest, which is only a dead oasis word. In other words, there is no rest when you have been displaced and pushed out of your home and are on the run and seeking some kind of refuge. That sticks with me.
So I don't have a favorite poem or a favorite line, but so I'll just speak about the first poem of Tala. The first section is called Death of My Mother, La Muerte de mi Madre, and the first poem is called La Fuga, which means the fugue. And fuga is escape, but it's also the fugal form, the musical form. And so what she does is she uses the image of following her mother in a dream, circling mountains and circling hills. So it begins, Madre mía, en el sueño ando por paisajes cardenosos. So it sounds so simple. Basically, my mother, or mother, maybe I'll keep it in Spanish, Madre mía. My mom was Puerto Rican, so why not use the Spanish, right? But then there's paisajes cardenosos. I wander through, cardenosos is thistled, like the thistle, but it's also, it can also be bruised, so the color. So I really struggled with, should it be, I've wandered through violet lands, but then I was at a bar in Scotland talking about the thistles in Scotland, and I asked the people who knew more of thistles than I said, hey, would it be really painful to walk through a landscape of thistles? And they said it would be horrific. So I just decided to use thistles. But the point is that there's no favorite poem for me, and you struggle for years with lines and the decision of a word, and really how close you can come to listening to that other person and rendering that other person in the language which you're speaking, which in my case is English, but I say English, but I grew up speaking both English and Spanish, so it's English pierced with so many other rhythms of Spanish and so many other languages. So, so yeah, I can't really speak to, I'm just telling you some, a line I've been thinking of lately, but there's so many lines, and there are constructions that are built over years. Yeah. But I guess that poem of her following her mother in a dream after her mother has passed away, and as being central to a book that she calls felling or fells is very striking to me.
Are there other comments or questions? We have a few minutes.
For Herr Nelly Sachs, it sounds like German isn't your first language. You're coming into it like translating a German poet while also learning German. I just wanted to know if you could speak on that more and that experience more and sort of how you got the confidence to be able to do that. Because as someone who's like learning another language and like loves reading poetry, I'm like, I feel like I can't no to poetry because this isn't my first language and I'm inherently missing out on some context.
She's asking about your chutzpah.
Yeah. So one has to have some, right? Yeah. So you just have to. So it starts with just wanting to please yourself. You're just doing it because you hear a sound, and the translations. If it's a poet who's been translated before, and Nelly Sachs had been translated before, but 50 years ago. You're not happy with the sound that in English that other translator has brought her into. You hear something else, and there's no one else who's gonna do that for you. So you're really just you're just doing something for yourself, and then you do it again and again and again. And if you're curious enough, you start asking people who you trust in the language to take a look at what you're doing, what you've done, and you enter deeper into the language that way too. There's probably no better way other than living in a country than living in its poetry for learning a language. Yeah. You just have to do it.
Question over here.
Rich Kashmarek. T.S. Eliot talks about discovering same places again and again. And I was wondering, following on that question, your doubts, the things that you did not understand and you still feel like you didn't understand, but you rediscover them every time you look at them. Can you share some of those moments of rediscovery?
I think that this is a question actually for all of us who've translated it, and with Sachs and Mistral, they're from the same generation, and some of the things some of the descriptions you were sharing about the nature of that poetics actually included in different ways Sachs too. I don't have anything really specific to share with you, but I can say, and I think we've all up here have had this kind of experience, I would say, in poems in our so-called mother tongue, of returning to them over and over again and having them open up with time. Most of the poems that I read in English, I don't really understand for a long time.
You're reminding me of your question as well, that one question that comes up a lot when we talk about translation is there anything you can't translate? And my answer to that is there anything you can say in your own language that's understood? You can tell someone 10 times a day, I love you, and 10 times a day they misunderstood. And then you tell your dog to sit, and your dog sits right down. Do you see what I mean? So translation is a metaphor for that fundamental difficulty of what it means to speak to another person, right? And it's very difficult to speak to another person. It's very difficult to say what you mean. That's why people are saying things so much, because it's hard to know what you mean. I think as far as revisiting a poem, it really does, the way I say it is you return with fresh ears to a poem so that you have your distance from it and it can sit. And in Spanish, I call it leave it en remojo, like when you're washing something and you have to leave it to soak, and time needs to do what it does to a fabric and a stain, and then you come back and the stain, you know, like you have to let time do what it's going to do to your ears so that you come back and revisit, is this poem meaningful to me in sound? Seamus Heaney talks a lot about this, and a sound being convincing to him, and actually in his mother tongue of Northern Ireland.
Ed, I wonder, is there like, can you speak to the experience of reading a poem that you were taken with as a young man, that you lived with over time, and the feeling or the meaning of which changed for you as you brought new experience to reading it?
T.S. Eliot famously said that poems communicate because before they're understood. And there's a way in which poems can reach you or affect you, because poems are experiences. And as an experience, you can have an effect of that experience before your consciousness quite understands what it is. It can sometimes, you can understand a poem sometimes, but you may not understand why it moves you. Or you may not understand why a great poem doesn't move you, because you haven't grown into the poem yet because of your own experiences. And I've often thought that the reason that Shakespeare's sonnets are so lost on the young is because what we're taught by them are just the language itself and how the language operates, whereas you have to grow into the experience in the late Shakespeare sonnets of what that experience is. So as you grow, as you change, as you develop over time, you begin to feel differently about different poems. Some poems that you adored when you were young, you love less, and other poems that you liked less well. And so I've had a lifelong, to answer your question, I've had a lifelong relationship to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which I think is an extraordinary poem and an exalted nightmare. But I myself am on another side from that. I'm on the William Carlos Williams and Hart Crane's side, and the Theodore Rutke side in American poetry, of trying to live in what Emerson calls the optative mood. And I'm seeking something more hopeful. I love the Eliot poem, but its vision, its negativity, its despair, which summarized life for so many people, is not quite for me. So as I've returned to it, I've become less interested. I mean, I've taught it so many times, and I think it's a magnificent poem. But finally, the question for me is how poems stand on the side of life, and where you stand in relationship to the side of life. And sometimes understanding poems has to do with understanding context, not just the words themselves, and how poems help you to live your life. And finally, I'm on the side of that, as Wallace Stevens says, the sounds of the words help us to live our lives. That's what I'm looking for in poetry.
If I could intervene briefly here to say that these three poets, rereading them because of this occasion and hearing you three speak, has made me feel more intensely than ever that we need poetry to cleanse our language. There are days when I feel that my mouth is full of filth. There's so much public language is nothing but filth. And not only public language. As you said, sometimes when you say I love you, who knows what that means? It can mean I would like to be a cannibal. And so I want to quote a sentence that I love from a letter by Gabriela Mistral. She said, "I look for primordial words that name truly, words without grime or wear, hard as axles of hawthorn wood, in the wagons of my Monte Grande, which is where she was born in a remote part of Chile. And that, I think, is what poetry gives us. It is these primordial words that name truly, and how hard it is in our lives, private and public, to name anything truly.
To ask Mr. Rushinek the same question.
Sorry, I can't.
Can you think of the poem or the sentence by Szymborska that comes like momentarily to your head as you think of her? Not, I know, it's a surprise.
I'm sorry, just first let me say that Szymborska was not, Szymborska didn't like to travel, but her poetry travels all around the world. It has just traveled to America, and I'm very proud of it. And she would be very proud of it, I'm sure. But there is one poem by Szymborska that sorry, it's just I don't have it. I'm not prepared.
Are you talking about the poem Could Have?
No, it's just not, I'm sure you don't know it because it hasn't been translated. It's,
You can really throw down by talking about a poem that hasn't been translated.
Yeah, I have it. This is actually the last poem that she wrote down in her notebook, and it wasn't included in the collected poems because we did not treat it as a finished poem. But then we decided it is a finished poem, and we added. And it's called, it's not called, it's just, I'll read it in Polish first, it's very short. Nie wiem jak to jest, być wypędzonym, wypędzoną, znaleźć się w kraju innego języka, prędko nauczyć się słowa dziękuję, jeśli ktoś pomoże, słowa przepraszam, jeśli ktoś spojrzy krzywo, nie być nigdy zbyt głodnym, kiedy cię częstują. And now in English, in my poor translation. I don't know what it is like to be expelled, to find yourself in a country with a different language, to quickly learn the words thank you if someone helps, the word sorry if someone looks at you askance, to never be too hungry when you're offered food. These are actually her last words that she wrote down. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Please, let's give our panel a hand. I feel like we could have another hour of these people, but sadly we have to wrap it up. Just thank everyone again. Thank you everyone again for coming.